You're watching HuffPost Live. I'm Nancy Red, and if I asked you what the divorce rate in America is, how would you answer the question? Many people, from the media to maybe even your spouse, have heard that it's 50%. Yes, half of all marriages allegedly end in divorce, and many people think the numbers are rising. But research shows that's actually not the case anymore, and it hasn't been the case for nearly 3 decades. So joining me now to discuss why so many of us have the divorce rates all wrong and the reasons behind the decline, we have Ben Stevens, a senior partner at the Stevens firm. We also have Dr. Galena Rhodes, a clinical psychologist and research associate professor of psychology at Denver University, Marina Sprocki, the author of Nasty Divorce, A Kid's Eye View, and Dr. William Doherty, the director of the Minnesota Couples on the Brink Project and professor of family social science at the University of Minnesota. I'm really excited about this conversation, y'all. It makes me have hope for my own marriage that these statistics are all wrong. But Dr. Doherty, where do we get the idea that half of all marriages end in divorce in the first place?
Well, what I have to say is that that's always been a projection, okay? And it's a 40-year projection. And it's based on data from the early baby boomers generation when the baby boomers are getting married. And so if you have, 2% get divorced a year, if you have that sort of projection out over 35 or 40 years, then you get 50 to, percent or higher. So it was never a fixed amount of current marriages. It was always a projection about the future. And the divorce rates have gone down since the baby boomers were in their marrying age. So it wasn't such a bad prediction at the beginning, but we've not kept up to date.
Dr. Rhodes, I don't understand. I mean, this is pretty cut and dry. You have to file legal paperwork. You have to file your taxes. Why have we always had this misinformation? Why has it always been a projection and not actual statistics?
Well, it's surprisingly hard to study the divorce rate. What Dr. Doherty explained is that it's really based on divorces and marriages that happened many, many years ago, and that's a different generation of people. So another way that people sometimes estimate the divorce rate is to look at the number of marriages per year versus the number of divorces per year. But that also doesn't give you a great sense of, if you're getting married today, what's my risk of divorce? And that's why, this research that is showing that there's actually been a decline is so important, because it really can help us understand what do we need to do to help couples really make their marriages work today.
Well, these projections didn't fool everybody. Laura Henri says, I've never believed that half of all marriages fail. I also know that those that do fail usually remarry. So, Marina, you're saying the studies are showing that divorce is on the decline. What would you say, Marina, the state of marriage is today?
Well, today I think some of the big reasons is that people are marrying later. So way back when, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, people got married a lot, right out of high school because they're trying to have sex. So they want to lock it up to get married. And then, people are just, then at that point, okay, well, we're 20, we need to get married. We're 24. So they're maybe rushing into marriages that they're not fully vetting out. Versus today, people are getting married a lot later. People are getting married in their 30s. So hopefully part of that decline, even though the statistics are maybe a little skewed, is that people are vetting a little better than they were before. And so not choosing to enter into a relationship to just have sex or to simply procreate, before they are an old maid at 24.
Dr. Doherty, weigh in here. So you're saying that nowadays kids don't just marry the first person that comes along and accepts the promise ring?
Oh, that's exactly right. Yes, I think we've become a little more discerning about who we marry. A lot of people cohabitate, of course, before marriage, and the average time of first marriage is like 27 for women, 28, 29 for men. So it's gone way up since the 1950s. And what we know, the biggest predictor, historically of high divorce was low age of marriage. Those teenage marriages, many of them were shotgun marriages. So we're not doing that anymore. But I think it's important to add here just one caveat that the divorce rate's gone down mainly for college-educated couples. It has not really budged much at all, if at all, for high school educated and people with less than high school education.
Dr. Rhodes, talk about that. I think that's an extremely important part of this conversation. Many tie, rightfully so, level of education with financial prowess. which also can lend to unhappy marriage.
Right, and we really are seeing widening gaps in terms of the divorce rate. Just as Dr. Doherty said, for people who have a college education, that's where we're seeing the biggest drop in terms of the divorce rate. And for people who have lower levels of education and lower income levels, we're not seeing that same drop in the divorce rate. And in fact, what we're really seeing overall is that although we may see marriage becoming more selective as fewer and fewer people get married and the divorce rate declining, we're seeing family instability continue to increase over time. Just as others have mentioned, people are waiting longer to get married or not getting married at all, but that doesn't mean they're not living with their partners. And it really doesn't mean that they're not having children. So as we've seen these shifts in the divorce rate, we've also seen big shifts in the number of children who are born to unmarried parents, and that figure is now over 40%, and that's even higher in some socioeconomic statuses and in some different cultural groups in our country. And so we see this increase actually in family instability, where there are fewer and fewer children who are going to grow up with both of their biological parents still together. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation.
I agree. Funny, when presented with this, there's such a larger conversation about the changing idea of what a family is in America, that this is just kind of a cornerstone of when we're talking about the divorce rates. It doesn't necessarily mean that a family is more stable because our divorce rates are going down. It just means that the family is changing. But when we're talking about divorce rates, Ben, I want to get you in here because you're the face that many people see, but no one necessarily wants to see. You see these divorces day in, day out. The studies are showing that divorce has been on the decline for 3 decades. What are you seeing in the courtroom?
Well, I think there are other factors that come into play. I don't think that marriages have generally gotten happier over the last 30 years. I think that the economic reality of divorce has really played a fact in it. I think on both ends of the economic spectrum, people, lower income people, a lot of times can't afford to get divorced. And so they'll just separate and live apart until one of them wants to remarry. A lot of times that'll prompt the divorce. On the higher end of the spectrum, a lot of times people will be waiting on the value of their home to rebound because the housing market crash, or if they own a business, for the value of the business to increase, or they just simply will stay together to not have to pay alimony or pay child support or decrease their lifestyle. And so they'll just agree to kind of live together as roommates but have separate lives. And we see that over and over and over again and have for the last 20 years.
And let's talk about that. How much does the average divorce cost? When we're talking, of course it can range, but let's talk percentage of income. Let's say the average family, 2 kids, average American household, average American income. What percentage of the income, the annual income, would a divorce cost?
That's a great question. It's hard to answer because it's really dependent upon the personalities. Divorce does not have to be an ugly process from the court perspective. Now, I'm not saying that, marriage is breaking up, it's time to break out the champagne and everybody be happy about it. But in cases where you've got 2 people that are reasonable and rational and look at it logically, the way I explain it to my clients is the divorce a lot of times is like the breakup of a business. It's the breakup of a marriage, and their assets and their debts and their financial things have to be worked through. Now, obviously, when there are children involved, most of the high conflict cases are cases where there are kids, and particularly custody cases.
Absolutely. When we're talking about that, Marina, I can't help but think that that's why the title of your book is called Nasty Divorce, A Kid's Eye View. I mean, that's the thing. One of the interesting aspects of this is in the current economic climate, people have had to kind of put their emotions on the back burner because of the financial instability, because of the recession. You just can't afford, literally and figuratively, to get all emotional and to go down the divorce route because it's expensive. And it can get really expensive when emotions are involved. Marina?
Oh yeah, really expensive, and he just used the right words: rational, logical those go out the window. Usually when people get divorced, the rationality and the logic, and the kids suffer. And even in those cases where they're not divorcing but staying together and don't like each other, those are children, and the psychologist can speak to this too, witnessing awful behavior, nastiness. Those are learned, and bad parenting goes a long way to damage children, especially during divorce. And that's in that nasty divorce. I've just been collecting stories for over 3 years that exemplify. These are all from children of divorce, most of them adults now, of how damaging it is. It's extremely damaging. I mean, extremely. When you're still worried about something when you're 40 that happened when you're 5, that's damaging.
Dr. Doherty, weigh in here. One of the reasons divorce and marriage might be on the decline both is because so many people had this cycle. Divorce peaked in the 80s, right? The research shows that divorce was at its peak in the 80s, which is my generation. We saw what happens when you have the nasty, expensive, bitter, caustic divorce, which is lending, as Dr. Rhodes mentioned, to less marriage, but also perhaps less divorce, perhaps these civil uncouplings.
Yeah, I think an encouraging sign is that the millennial generation, who were the children of divorce, the baby boomers of my generation pioneered so many things, including high levels of divorce. Well, the millennial generation are not starting out on the same trajectory, high divorce trajectory, as the older generation, even though by prior research you would think they are higher risk for divorce, because we know the children of divorce are high risk for divorce themselves. So we don't know why exactly, but it could be that that any kind of romance that might have been in my era in the 70s, that really was the 70s was the big increase in the divorce, not the 80s actually. These young people are saying, let's try to figure out a way to make this work because we don't want our kids to go through it. At least that's the speculation.
Dr. Rhodes, weigh in here because we've had conversations about the decline of marriage in general. One of the things about millennials and recent generations is that marriage isn't considered the first thing you do. It's like the fourth thing. You go to college, you get a great job, you have your savings, and then you get married. So we'll see what happens when this next generation of people get married. Kind of it seems like 2 generations in one are all getting married much later, so we have to wait to see what the studies show with this new batch of people.
I think that's right. You know, from a research perspective, it's really hard for us to predict how the generation of people getting married today might fare because we're basing our predictions on their parents' relationships, and those might look really different. And I think, you know, this idea of wanting to have everything in place before getting married and wanting to try out the relationship by living together comes from a really good place. I think it does come from wanting to be sure that marriage is the right decision and that you know you're marrying the right person and that you're going to have a stable, long-lasting marriage. I think partly what we forget about, though, is that means that people have all kinds of relationship experiences in their 20s into their 30s, and that those experiences are really meaningful, and ending those relationships, even when it's not a marriage and you're not getting a divorce, can be really difficult and destructive as well. So ending a living together relationship, you know, especially if there are children involved, can look just as hard as getting a divorce. And in fact, in some ways, there's less support around it. There's less social support for understanding what ending a living together relationship looks like. And there's much less legal support as well for going through that process. And custody can sometimes be even more tricky when a couple hasn't been married.
Ben, I want to bring you back into this conversation because not only are you a divorce lawyer, so you can speak from that perspective, you've also been divorced 3 times, right?
Twice, yes. I'm married. I'm actually married to my law partner now, but yes, I've been divorced twice, and it brings a whole new perspective to it.
This is amazing. So 2 divorce lawyers got married.
We did.
So what's your secret? Because you have to know. And that what she just said is very important. Getting married provides you benefits and provides you options. Now, you're of the old school. You still are getting married. Like, you 2 guys got married.
I'm from marriage.
You're from Maryland. So what happens is, like, for example, as the research is showing, my generation is, like, not even getting married. What's your take on this? When we're talking about, as it was just mentioned, that there are fewer legal benefits, there are fewer options to you if you're not married. Obviously, knowing what you know as a divorce lawyer, you're married for the third time to another divorce lawyer. What's your take on this? Marriage is still worth it, in your opinion?
It is. And obviously, I mean, my wife had been married twice before as well, and we both have kids with our exes. And so to say that we were ultra sure and ultra cautious before we got married is an understatement, because neither of us wanted to go through that a third time. But yeah, I mean, it's, marriage is great if you have the right partner, and it's horrible if you don't. And I say that from 20 years of doing what I do for a living, and from, being divorced twice. So, I don't think that's really news to anybody, though.
It's absolutely not news to anyone. Marina, you mentioned earlier that, again, this generation of individuals looking for partners has been there, done that, seen divorce from the kids' perspective. What do you see when we're talking about, you also have been divorced, you're also remarried, from this perspective, from the inside out? Where do we go from here? Is marriage something that we should encourage for the next generation as something, despite the fact that might increase divorce rates? Who knows?
Yeah, what I think should be encouraged for the next generation is mental health. So whittling all your baggage down to a carry-on item before you get in that next relationship. So everyone, and talking from the kids of the 70s, so I was a product of that, and some abusive and some other bad parenting and the divorce and the things you see, that's going to shape you and your relationships. So if you don't fix those things, you could wait till you're 50 to get married, and that won't make a bit of a difference. So I think the true message for people is to get mentally healthy, to know where you stand in relationships, to see what's happened to you in the past that's shaped you. Are you fearful? Are you mistrusting? Are you jealous? What issues do you have? And I think the more we can communicate effectively, talk openly, and kind of clean out the cobwebs, that will always fare better for marriages. And, you can't predict the future, but I think if you can go in with less problems, you have a better chance.
Dr. Doty, I want to bring you back in. The New York Times recently did say that the peak of divorces was in the 1980s, but still, even with the decline, the rate is twice that it was in the 1960s of divorce. One of the things that your studies show, which I find really interesting, piggybacking on what Marina said about mental health, getting check, acknowledging what you want, what you don't want. What I find interesting is the proactive individuals. 2/3 of divorces are instigated by whom?
By women. Just so we clarify the demographics, the acceleration occurred in the 70s, and then the peak was in the 80s. So we're both right on that one. But yeah, the 2/3 of divorces, and this has been the research for decades, that 2/3 of divorces are initiated by women. So a lot of people don't know that. A lot of women particularly are surprised by that.
Ben, are you surprised by that?
No, I mean, that's we represent about half and half, male and female, and that doesn't surprise me a bit.
Why not?
Well, I mean, I think that with everything else in society, I mean, certainly women's rights are not where they should be, but they're certainly a whole lot better than they were 30 years ago. And I think as women continue to gain power and social acceptance in other circles, that would naturally transfer over to the divorce arena.
Speaking of that, Dr. Rhodes, that's one of the things when we're looking at this from a larger perspective. Who benefits from marriage, right? In a society where both parties can earn money, and many times when we're looking at the 50s and 60s, there were relationships that the inequality caused imbalance in power that frequently did not behoove the female partner. Dr. Rhodes? We've seen some research that showed that men's health in particular is really benefited by men being married, and that we don't quite see the same general benefits for women's health. But I think we're at a place in our society where most of us recognize that both adults and children do best when the parents are in stable relationships, stable, committed relationships. And marriage is maybe the easiest way to accomplish a stable, long-lasting relationship. It certainly doesn't have to be the only way to accomplish that. But we certainly know that both men and women and children benefit when there are stable, committed relationships involved. Just because the rate is going down doesn't make divorce any less a part of our society. Marina, for anyone in a relationship, seeing these statistics might make them wonder, well, am I supposed to stay in this marriage that's not working, or am I just supposed to battle it out just because I'm broke or I don't want to be alone? What is your advice for someone considering divorce?
Well, I think it depends on the individual. So I don't think that somebody, leaves the towel on the floor all the time and you're sick of it, get divorced. I mean, that's crazy. Find out what you can work out. But the most important thing, should you choose to decide to get divorced, I'm a huge believer in counseling, and family counseling especially. So I would definitely go that route first to see what the issue is. If you still decide that you ultimately divorce is the best decision, be kind, love your children more than you hate your ex. I implore you to do that. Children are not objects. They are real people that turn into adults. And if you don't want to see all the messed up things that you see in the news that come from trauma, which again, the doctor psychologist can speak to that. It is so important that you remain at least kind and respectful. You don't have to, you don't have to stay married to somebody you don't want to stay married to. But if you do have children, I urge you to take the high road. I really urge you to take the high road.
Ben, weigh in here. After 20 years in the industry, you've, I'm sure, seen divorces because of a towel on the floor and divorces that should have happened way before they finally did. What's your advice for individuals in a relationship trying to decide if they want to become part of the statistic or not?
Well, I mean, I remind people that divorce is never a pleasant process, but it doesn't have to be awful. And that, to put it bluntly, life's too short to be miserable. And if there is no way to save the marriage, and that's always the first question, like Marina said, will counseling help? Is there anything else that can be done to save it? And if not, then, we can help get you out of it the easy way or the hard way. And our preference certainly is always to try to do it the easy way. And we encourage our clients to be reasonable and hope the other side will as well. And if that's the case, then, again, it's not great, but it doesn't have to be awful.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. We appreciate you, Ben, Dr. Rose, Marina, and Dr. Doherty for joining us today. Now, all of you can read more about marriage and divorce by clicking on the links in our resource web below, and stay tuned because, as you know, the conversation always continues here at HuffPost Live.